A German shepherd halted at the tree line, ears alert, tail still. Behind him, a man in uniform paused, breath caught in his throat. The dog didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He simply stared at the old cabin half swallowed by moss and time. Officer Mark Rhodes knew that look. Shadow had smelled something wrong. Inside the cabin, beneath cracked rafters and rotting beams, sat a coffin. Not old, not dusty, pristine, welded shut, and waiting. Shadow stepped forward first, limping slightly on his old wound, and stood beside it. His body trembled, but he didn't back away. He wasn't afraid. He remembered. This isn't just a story about a strange coffin in the woods. It's about a man who followed his dog into darkness, a dog who never forgot what danger smells like, and a secret someone tried too hard to bury. Subscribe if you believe the truth always finds a way out. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? It was just after 9 p.m. when the last light died behind the ridgeline and the pines stood like silent watchmen. Rain brushed against the cruiser windshield as Officer Mark Rhodes leaned into the wheel, squinting at the winding Forest Service road ahead. Pine Brook, Washington. A town that mostly slept by 8 and whispered by 9 was already locked up for the night. But the woods never slept. Mark was 38, clean-cut but grizzled at the edges. Years in the Army followed by over a decade in the law enforcement had stripped the shine off him. He had a strong jawline shadowed by 2-day stubble, and eyes the color of worn asphalt always scanning, never still. He wasn't the kind to talk unless words mattered. The quiet had become a shield, especially after Sarah passed. He hadn't stepped foot in church since the funeral, but he still said her name aloud on foggy nights, like tonight. His only companion on patrol was Shadow, a 10-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat flecked with gray. His left ear flopped permanently from a training injury, and his hind leg bore a faint scar, the mark of a bullet from a meth raid gone bad years ago. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was the last thread tying Mark to a life that once had rhythm. When the town offered to retire the old K9, Mark refused. Shadow wasn't finished yet, and neither was he. The rain had softened to mist, tapping against the cruiser roof. Mark reached for his thermos lukewarm coffee and stale exhaustion when Shadow suddenly lifted his head from the back seat. Ears perked, eyes sharp. Then came the growl. Mark stiffened. "What is it, boy?" Shadow whined once, then shifted his weight toward the window. His breath fogged the glass. Then, without hesitation, he gave a sharp bark and pawed at the door. Mark pulled over, grabbing the flashlight from the dash. Shadow leapt down the moment the door clicked open, sniffing the air with intensity. They were in the northern section of the Pine Brook National Forest, near Old Logging Route 9. No homes out here, just deer, black bears, and the occasional camper who didn't read posted signs. But Shadow was focused, nose low, tail straight, moving fast. Mark followed. His boots sank slightly in the damp moss as they left the road and entered the underbrush. "Keep it tight," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. He trusted Shadow more than most men. The forest swallowed them quickly. Trees closed in like a cathedral, the sound of the cruiser engine fading into dripping branches. They hiked for 5 minutes, no trail, no markers, just Shadow tracking something Mark couldn't see or smell. Then the dog stopped. Before them stood a cabin. Old, wooden, its roof caved in at one end, ivy crawling up the walls like veins. The porch sagged from decades of rot. Windows were black hollows. It didn't appear on any ranger maps Mark remembered. He knew this forest, but he didn't know this place. Shadow stood perfectly still, eyes locked on the door. Mark approached cautiously, sweeping his flashlight across the facade. No footprints, no tire tracks, just the kind of ruin nature usually reclaims without resistance. But something about it felt preserved. The front door creaked open with one gentle push. Inside was darkness, thick and undisturbed. Mark stepped in, Shadow close behind. The beam of the flashlight revealed a bare, rotting floor. No furniture, no dust-covered clutter, no evidence of habitation until it landed on the center of the room. A coffin. Black, smooth, pristine. No scratches, no dust, not even a leaf out of place. Mark's breath caught. The smell hit next chemical, acrid, mixed with the scent of scorched metal and something antiseptic. He lowered the light. The coffin wasn't just clean, it was too clean, out of place in a building otherwise consumed by decay. Shadow growled low, circling it once, then pausing. His head tilted. He barked once, then sniffed the floorboards beneath it. Mark knelt beside him. The flashlight swept under the coffin. No spiders, no mold, no debris. He reached out, hesitating for half a second before placing his hand against the side. Cold. Unnaturally cold, even for a wet forest night. "Someone put you here," Mark whispered. He took a slow walk around the room. The flashlight danced across the warped walls, revealing nothing until it landed on a strange detail. Scratched faintly into the far beam, almost hidden by peeling paint, was a series of numbers. 6 digits. A date? 06. 18/03, June 18th, 2003. Mark didn't know what happened that day, but someone had etched it with purpose. Shadow suddenly barked again, claws scratching near a moss-covered support beam in the corner. Mark moved to his side and saw something tucked between the slats. A torn page, wet and folded. He pried it free and unfolded it gently. It was a child's drawing. Crude, crayon on lined paper, a black box in the center surrounded by tall trees. Beneath it, a stick figure with a red X over the eyes. Mark's spine stiffened. That wasn't just a picture. That was a warning. He slipped the page into a Ziploc evidence pouch and looked back at the coffin. Rain thudded louder now on the cabin roof, mixing with the whisper of wind in the pines. Something about this wasn't right. He didn't call it in. Not yet. Not until he knew what he was dealing with. But as he turned to leave, flashlight beam scanning the shadows one last time, his gut twisted with a creeping realization. This wasn't a forgotten structure. It had been waiting. The silence in the cabin thickened as the rain outside picked up, drumming softly on the sagging roof. Mark approached the black coffin, its smooth, lacquered surface gleaming faintly in the beam of his flashlight. From a distance, it might have passed for something ceremonial expensive even, but up close, the details betrayed a darker purpose. The welds were the first clue. They weren't the clean, uniform lines used by professional morticians. These were crude, rough, and ugly thick seams of burned steel that bubbled slightly at the edges, as if someone in a hurry had sealed it with a handheld torch. Mark crouched, running his gloved fingers along the lid's edge. The metal still smelled faintly scorched, the tang of iron and fuel laced with something chemical and bitter. Shadow stood close beside him, tail stiff, head low. The German shepherd's hackles had risen slightly, a ripple in his thick sable coat. He gave a low growl, then began barking, sharp and urgent, as his nose pushed toward the lower side of the coffin. He pawed at the floorboards beneath it, claws scraping against the rotting wood, sending a harsh echo through the room. Mark leaned closer, feeling the air shift. The smell was stronger down here, chemical, almost synthetic, like cleaning fluid mingled with rust. Not just the coffin. Something had seeped into the wood itself. Shadow's behavior only heightened Mark's unease. The dog was seasoned, old enough to have worked crime scenes and searches, trained to react to drugs, blood, accelerants. He wasn't just spooked, he was alerting. Mark's hand drifted to his radio again. "Lila, you still there?" Static answered at first, then her voice, tight and alert. "Go ahead. I've got something strange out here. The coffin, it's welded shut. Shadow's reacting. Definitely not a funeral home job." There was a pause. "Mark, there's more." "Gabe. The boy from earlier, his parents just called in. He's gone. Didn't come home last night." Mark stood slowly, the weight of that sentence dropping into his chest like a stone. "Mrs. Samuels said he was sketching the woods again after school. He mentioned something about going back to find the black box. They thought he was just talking nonsense, but he hasn't been seen since. Mark glanced at Shadow, who was still nosing the floor, now circling toward the far wall. "I think we're going to need a full unit out here," he said. "And Lila, bring a medic. And gloves, a lot of gloves." "Copy that," she replied. "ETA 15 minutes. Mark clicked off the radio and turned to examine the rest of the cabin. His flashlight beam landed on something half-hidden near the far corner, an old canvas rucksack. He approached slowly. It was collapsed, damp from a leak in the ceiling. Inside were 3 dented cans of soup, a half-empty plastic bottle of water, and a roll of duct tape. Nearby, a pair of dark blue work gloves lay discarded on the floor, one turned inside out as though someone had pulled them off in a hurry. Shadow moved to the corner and began pawing again. Mark followed the dog's movement, crouched low, and spotted something tucked between the boards, a small scrap of cloth, soaked and dirty. He lifted it with tweezers from his kit, a child's handkerchief, pale yellow, embroidered with a faded cartoon dog in the corner, and a dark, rust-colored stain blood, dried and crusted near the edge. "Damn it," Mark muttered. The pieces didn't just suggest a drug stash or a cult ritual gone wrong. They pointed toward something far more disturbing. Someone had been staying here. Someone had brought supplies, and someone had bled. He bagged the handkerchief carefully, then turned back to the coffin. For a moment he simply stood there, staring. It didn't make sense. Why here? Why this place? And then he saw it faint grooves in the wooden floor, circling the coffin's base. Not scratch marks, drag marks. The coffin had been moved. Mark crouched, studying the pattern. It hadn't always sat in the center of the room. At some point, someone had shifted it into the light, presented it, like a message. His flashlight beam fell on the underside of the lid, a slight gap between weld and wood, almost imperceptible, but there, not sealed by a pro. Maybe rushed, maybe panicked. Shadow growled again, low and guttural, his gaze locked on the small attic opening above the rafters. Mark's blood ran cold. Something, or someone, had been up there. He swept the beam across the ceiling. Dust shifted slightly near the open hatch, disturbed recently. He couldn't see beyond the slats, but Shadow wouldn't look away. He stood still, listening, but heard nothing. The dog, however, took one slow step forward and let out a single, piercing bark. Mark drew his weapon, but the silence remained. He backed toward the door, signaling Shadow to heel. The dog obeyed, though reluctantly, eyes never leaving the hatch. As they stepped outside, the night greeted them with cold breath and wind in the trees, and in the distance approaching headlights. Mark stood motionless before the black coffin, the weight of the forest pressing in from every side. Rain pelted the cabin roof like distant drumming, and every crack in the wood seemed to echo the heaviness settling in his chest. He could still feel the chill that had crept up his arm when he touched the surface of the coffin cold, not from the rain or the forest air, but something else, something unnatural. Shadow sat low at his side, eyes fixed on the coffin with quiet intensity. The dog hadn't made a sound since they found the child's drawing, but his posture was unmistakable nervous, coiled, and ready to react. Mark had seen that look in war zones. Shadow wasn't afraid. He was warning. Mark set his flashlight on the floor so the beam washed upward across the box, revealing the uneven sheen of the lid. The light flickered slightly as he reached for the multi-tool in his duty belt and found the flat pry bar attachment. His gloved fingers tensed as he worked the tip into the shallow seam between wood and metal. The welds weren't perfect, just like he suspected, bubbled, uneven, done in haste. A soft screech of metal against metal split the silence. Shadow growled low, ears pulling back. Mark paused, listening. Nothing moved but the trees outside. He continued. The lid shifted, giving a fraction of an inch, then more as he pressed with steady, practiced force. Finally, it gave way with a soft click, and Mark eased it open, lifting it just high enough to see inside. He exhaled. No body, no bones, no smell of rot or death, just velvet deep crimson, smooth, stretched tightly across the interior. Too tightly. He leaned closer. The material was pristine, unwrinkled, but the cushioning felt off. He pressed it with his palm. It resisted. Beneath the velvet, something solid. He grabbed his flashlight again, aiming it directly into the interior. The folds of the lining were too smooth, too symmetrical. Reaching carefully, he traced one edge of the fabric and found a seam loose, not glued or stitched, just tucked in. He peeled it back. Steel. A dull, industrial gray plate had been fitted perfectly inside the coffin, concealed beneath the velvet-like armor under a suit. It bore faint scuff marks, likely from being moved. Mark tapped it once hollow, but dense. He stepped back and grabbed his body camera from his chest rig, clicking it on. A small red light blinked to life. He began narrating softly as he filmed, describing every angle, every surface. Interior lining. Reinforced. Concealed compartment. Possible false bottom. No human remains. As he filmed, the beam of the flashlight swept up the inside wall of the cabin and revealed something he hadn't seen before. Above, the hearth bare and crumbling someone had drawn with chalk. Faint white lines formed 3 intersecting triangles in a circular pattern. Beneath that, letters in a language Mark couldn't recognize. He stood, moving toward it. The symbols had been made recently. The chalk wasn't washed by water or dust. Some lines had smudged but still held shape. He knew those markings. He'd seen a similar set in a narcotics case 2 years ago, recovered from a trailer on the outskirts of Spokane. Back then, the case had ended in blood. The symbols were believed to be part of a code used by an interstate smuggling ring, unique identifiers for routes, contacts, drop zones. Cryptic, hard to trace, and always followed by silence from higher-ups when he tried to pursue the investigation further. A low rumble broke the stillness. Shadow. He was staring at the cabin window, shoulders stiff, lips pulled slightly to reveal his teeth. Mark moved quickly, turning off the camera light and stepping silently to the side of the window frame. The glass was long broken, the frame warped, but there was no mistaking the sound. Footsteps. Wet leaves. Soft. Deliberate. Someone was outside. Shadow let out a guttural snarl and took a step forward, but Mark gave a sharp whistle, short, commanding. The dog froze, but didn't look away. Mark held his breath and waited. The footsteps paused. Then nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the ticking of rain. He kept the light off and approached the coffin again, lifting the velvet layer completely from the steel plate. His fingers found 2 recessed bolts fasteners, not just supports. Whatever was hidden inside had been locked in, a hide compartment. He wasn't going to open it now, not in the dark and not alone. Instead, he closed the lid gently, letting it settle into place. Then he stepped back, turned the flashlight to low, and scanned the room for anything else out of place. His eyes landed on the hearth again. Ashes. He moved closer and brushed away the top layer with the back of his glove. Beneath the cold remnants of old wood, he found burned scraps of cloth. Blue. Synthetic. Like cheap uniforms. Melted plastic beside them. Maybe a badge? Hard to tell. Mark bagged one piece and checked his watch. He'd been here almost 30 minutes. It was time to call for backup. And this time, it wouldn't just be local. As he reached for his radio, Shadow growled again, short, loud, alerting. The footsteps were back, faster now, fading into the woods. Whoever had been watching was retreating. Mark didn't chase. Not yet. He pressed the button on his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 49. I need immediate assistance at an unregistered cabin northeast of Route 9. Grid reference coming. Advise we have possible evidence of controlled substance storage, coded symbols consistent with known trafficking networks, and unknown individuals in proximity. Send backup with forensic unit." Shadow stood beside him, tail stiff, breathing steady, still watching the window. Mark followed his gaze into the dark, but saw nothing. Only trees and the hollow echo of someone who had almost stayed too long. The wind shifted. Mark felt it in his spine before he heard it. The faint rustle of disturbed underbrush outside the cabin walls, not far. It wasn't the wind brushing through pine needles or a deer spooked by light. It was slower, heavier, intentional. He turned off his flashlight and stood still, letting his breath settle. Shadow was already at the broken window, ears forward, body lowered. His muscles tensed like coiled rope. A low growl trembled from his chest. Mark stepped lightly toward the door, one hand on his holster. He wasn't new to ambush. He knew when he was being watched. Then the sound came, branches snapping under weight. Not one person, multiple. And they weren't trying hard to be quiet anymore. He was halfway through a warning command to Shadow when the first shadow moved, barely visible in the fog beyond the tree line. Then came the second, and a third. 3 silhouettes moved between the trees, black against black. One held something long in his hand metal, glinting briefly in the light from Mark's body cam before it was swallowed by dark. Mark didn't hesitate. He backed toward the coffin again, hand on his weapon. "Shadow," he said calmly. "Guard." The dog tensed, eyes tracking the movement outside, growling louder now. Then it happened, swift and without warning. The door burst open. A man charged through, tall, hooded, face masked by a black cloth. In his hands a steel pipe raised high. Shadow leapt before the man could swing. The dog collided with the attacker's side, teeth sinking into his forearm. The man screamed and staggered, pipe clattering to the floor as he slammed into the wall. Mark drew his weapon and shouted, "Police! Down, now!" But the second man was already at the doorway, raising what looked like a compact pistol. Mark fired once low and centered. The man dropped to the ground with a sharp grunt and scrambled backward through the mud, his weapon lost somewhere outside. The third man didn't come through the door, he moved along the side of the cabin. Shadow released the first attacker, now clutching his bleeding arm, and turned toward the rear exit instinctively. Mark followed the dog's motion just in time to see movement at the back window. A flash of metal. He ducked. A bullet tore through the cabin wall where his head had been a heartbeat ago. He rolled across the floor, firing a warning shot through the window. "Back off!" he shouted into the dark. There was silence, then the soft, fading crunch of boots retreating into the woods. The attacker Shadow had bitten groaned, then stumbled after his companions, leaving behind smears of blood on the doorframe and bark where he had braced against a tree. Mark kept his gun up, breath tight in his chest, waiting to see if they'd regroup. But they didn't. The forest swallowed them. He moved slowly to the window, listening. Only wind, and Shadow's breathing. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed the radio on his chest. "Dispatch, this is Rhodes. Shots fired at my location. 3 suspects. Cabin at grid coordinate 22F. They're fleeing west, likely on foot. Officer not injured. Request immediate backup." There was static, then a reply. "Copy that, 49. Deputy Quinn en route. ETA 4 minutes. Medics and support following." Mark exhaled. The chaos had passed, but the danger hadn't. He turned back to the room, flashlight once again sweeping across broken beams and the disturbed coffin. That's when he saw it. The lid had shifted slightly, just enough to reveal the edge of a black velvet panel inside. Something glinted faintly underneath. He approached and carefully lifted the lining where he'd tucked it earlier. There, nearly hidden beneath the steel plate, was a tiny compartment at the head of the coffin. A slot. Reaching in, he pulled free a small black object plastic casing, waterproof, cold to the touch. A USB drive. He turned it over in his palm, frowning. There was no label, no engraving, just a faint dent on the side like it had been shoved into place in a hurry. Mark slipped it into his inner vest pocket just as headlights cut through the mist outside. A vehicle. Not the attackers returning, this light was steady, familiar. Within seconds, tires crunched over gravel. A sheriff's cruiser. Deputy Lila Quinn stepped out, her figure immediately recognizable. Lila was 32, African-American, lean and tall with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes that always looked like they were trying to solve you before you spoke. She had the presence of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. She approached fast, weapon low but ready. "Mark, are you hit?" He shook his head. "Negative. 3 men, all masked. One had a gun, one with a pipe. Shadow disabled one, but they retreated." Lila looked past him into the cabin. "That what I think it is?" "Depends on what you think it is," Mark replied grimly. "But it's definitely not a coffin in the usual sense." Shadow was licking a gash on his leg, but it looked superficial. Lila knelt beside him, giving him a quick once-over with a soft hand. "He's good," she said, "but I'll have the vet meet us at the station just in case." Then she looked up at him. "Mark, what the hell is going on here?" He pulled the USB from his vest and held it between 2 fingers. "I don't know yet," he said, "but someone didn't want us to find this." Back at the Cedar Hollow precinct, the overhead lights buzzed quietly as Mark and Lila stood over the evidence table. The USB drive, still cold from the storm, lay between them like a ticking clock. Mark plugged it into the secure station laptop, his eyes sharp but tired. The screen blinked. A single folder appeared, labeled T-Route 45. Inside were several documents, some spreadsheets with coded names, dates, and quantities, but one item drew both their attention instantly. A topographical map marked with red symbols scattered across the Cedarwood National Forest. Each was hand-drawn. Circles, arrows, and X's. One was less than a mile from where they'd found the coffin. Lila leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "Looks like drop points," she murmured. "Supply routes, maybe even stash locations." Mark clicked to zoom. That would explain the reinforced coffin. It wasn't made to bury anything. It was made to hide cargo. Shadow sat at Mark's feet, ears twitching. His breathing had returned to normal after the fight, though a slight limp still favored his scarred leg. He watched the screen, too, tail thumping once when Mark's finger hovered over one of the red X's. Lila crossed her arms. "We can't take this lightly. This is too big for a rural precinct." Mark nodded. "Agreed. I know someone at the Bureau. We served together in narcotics. He owes me more than a few favors." He picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. "Wallace? Dean, it's Mark." A pause. "Rhodes? Haven't heard your voice since El Paso. What's going on? Need your eyes on something. Off the record, at first." Dean Wallace, now in his mid-40s, was a seasoned FBI agent with a sharp eye and a gruffer voice. He had a square jaw, always clean-shaven, and a deep crease above his right eyebrow, a permanent scar from a failed raid years ago. Trustworthy, but not one to sugarcoat. They'd once been partners, and while their careers had diverged, their bond remained. "I'm sending over something encrypted," Mark said. "Map, coordinates, possibly cartel movement through state land." "You always find the weird ones," Dean muttered. "Send it. I'll take a look." Mark clicked the files into an encrypted transfer. Meanwhile, Shadow had risen, moving toward the door. His nose sniffed the air, tail suddenly alert. Mark noticed the shift. "He smells something." Without needing a leash, Shadow led the way. Mark followed, motioning for Lila to come. They drove a short way into the forest, guided by the map and the old logging roads barely used since the 70s. The sky was overcast, light struggling through the pine canopy. As they moved deeper, the noise of civilization faded to nothing, just the soft crunch of tires on wet leaves. They parked and continued on foot, Shadow weaving ahead like a silent scout. After about 20 minutes, Shadow halted near a thicket, nose pressed to the ground. He barked once, then began digging beneath a pile of broken branches and dry pine. Mark stepped forward, pulling back a mat of dead foliage. A trapdoor metal, rusted but reinforced, not from any forest ranger's design. Someone had built this deliberately, low and flat to avoid detection. Lila crouched beside him. "They used this as a stash site?" "Or a hideout," Mark said. He tugged the door. It groaned open, revealing a steep incline of concrete steps and the heavy scent of motor oil and rubber. Shadow refused to go in, instead sniffing around the entrance. His head suddenly jerked left. He darted toward a patch of brush 10 yards away, barking sharply. Mark tensed. "Shadow!" A soft cry echoed from the woods. It wasn't a bark or an animal. It was a child. Mark sprinted after Shadow, Lila right behind him. There, curled at the base of a tree and half covered in leaves, was Gabe the missing boy whose drawing had first alerted the town's attention. He looked smaller than the photo Mark had seen. 8, maybe 9 years old, with curly dark hair matted with dirt and tear tracks dried across his cheeks. His shirt was torn, his knees scraped and caked in dried blood. When he saw Shadow, he didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. He simply reached out a trembling hand and whispered, "Doggy." Shadow stepped gently forward and licked the boy's hand. Gabe burst into tears. Mark crouched beside him, checking his pulse, brushing away branches. "I got you," he said softly. "You're safe now." Lila knelt on Gabe's other side, offering him her water bottle. "You're okay. We're going to take you home." Gabe clung to Shadow's neck like he was the only safe thing left in the world. As Lila examined Gabe's injuries, mostly surface wounds, Mark noticed something crumpled in the boy's hand. A scrap of paper. He carefully unfolded it. A handwritten note. "Delivery. 3 crates. Friday. Red pine root. 11:45 a.m." Below that, a strange symbol matching one of the chalk designs from the cabin. Mark's pulse quickened. They were still active. He looked up toward the trap door hidden in the brush. And the clock, he realized, was ticking. The sun hadn't fully risen when the FBI's unmarked SUVs rolled into Cedar Hollow, their tires whispering across the damp gravel of the precinct's side lot. The sky was a watercolor of gray and blue, streaked with the aftermath of the previous night's rain. Fog clung low over the ground, coiling like smoke through the trees, a perfect veil for the trap they were about to set. Mark stood beside Shadow just outside the station. The German shepherd, now cleaned but still bearing the faint scent of earth and pine, sat at full alert. His ears twitched at the hum of engines, and his eyes flicked toward the line of new arrivals. He hadn't left Mark's side since the night before, his instincts sharpened by something deeper than duty. Shadow was no stranger to danger, and danger, he could feel, was already nearby. Dean Wallace stepped out of the lead vehicle. His dark overcoat flapped with the breeze, and the tired lines around his eyes were more pronounced in the morning light. A tall man with a commanding presence, Dean had the quiet intensity of someone who'd seen too many operations go sideways. "Rhodes," he said with a nod. "Wallace, thanks for coming fast." "Couldn't ignore that USB, or the kid," Dean replied, glancing toward the station where Gabe was being cared for. Inside, Gabe sat at a table with a warm blanket around his shoulders, a cup of cocoa between his hands. Across from him sat Agent Melanie Reyes, a forensic sketch artist and profiler. Melanie was in her late 30s, petite but sharp-eyed, with a precise way of speaking and a gentle manner around children. Her dark brown curls were tied back, revealing a long scar along her jawline, a memento from an undercover job gone wrong. Gabe, though nervous, had taken to her. "He had a badge," he whispered, "but it was shiny, like not real, and he smelled like paint." Melanie offered him a sheet of paper and crayons. "Can you show me what he looked like?" Gabe nodded and began sketching, his small hands moving with surprising confidence. Mark, watching through the glass, felt his chest tighten. No child should know how to do this. Meanwhile, outside, preparations for the sting were underway. A fake coffin, near identical to the original, had been fabricated overnight by a rapid response FBI unit. It was loaded with a hidden camera and tracking sensors. Dean and Lila walked the perimeter of the chosen cabin site, now surrounded discreetly by agents in camouflage gear. "We'll stage the recovery scene," Dean explained. "Act like we missed this drop the first time. Let them come back for it." Mark nodded, but his eyes remained on Shadow, who was sniffing the base of a nearby tree, tail low. The dog growled suddenly. Low, deep, not in alarm, but suspicion. Mark followed his gaze. A man in tactical gear stood near one of the temporary base tents, clipboard in hand. Shadow walked forward, cautious, then stopped about 5 feet away. His nostrils flared. He whined. Then he barked. Loud. Once, twice. Everyone turned. The man froze. Mark stepped forward. "You? With Pinebrook or Bureau? The man looked up, then offered a too-fast smile. Bureau. Logistics. Dean narrowed his eyes. Name? The man hesitated, just a beat too long. Porter. Dan Porter. Dean's jaw tensed. We don't have a Dan Porter. Shadow lunged, not to attack, but to plant himself between the man and Mark. His body rigid, eyes locked on the imposter. Hands, where I can see 'em, barked Dean. But Porter was already turning. He bolted through the trees. Shadow! Mark shouted. The German shepherd needed no further cue. He was after him in seconds, paws pounding over wet roots and moss, his old injury barely slowing him down. Mark and 2 agents followed with weapons drawn, their radios crackling. Shadow moved like a ghost through the undergrowth, and within 50 yards he lunged, catching the man's ankle and dragging him down with a furious bark. The man screamed, trying to wrestle free, but Shadow held fast until Mark arrived. He cuffed the man swiftly. Dean caught up, panting. Guess we found our leak. The man was later identified as Samuel Griggs, a suspended officer from the Pinebrook Department. Dishonorably discharged for falsifying evidence 5 years prior. He'd vanished off the radar and had clearly resurfaced in the woods with a new purpose. Back at the station, Gabe's drawing was complete. He handed it to Melanie. The face he drew had a twisted smile and small, deep-set eyes. One detail stood out, a jagged scar running across the man's cheekbone. Mark walked in just as she compared the sketch to old personnel files. Her face paled. This matches Griggs. Mark looked at Shadow, who now lay at Gabe's feet, calm again, but still watchful. We've got confirmation, Dean said. The network has someone inside Pinebrook, and they know we're closing in. Mark exhaled slowly. Then we need to finish this before someone else disappears. Outside, as the agents resumed their setup around the cabin, Shadow quietly walked the edge of the tree line, stopping at every fork, every scent trail, and pausing just long enough to memorize the danger hiding in the branches. He didn't trust anyone but Mark, and today his instincts had been right again. The woods of Cedar Hollow were unusually quiet that night. Even the wind, usually rustling through the pines like a ghost's sigh, seemed to be holding its breath. Mark crouched behind a fallen log, his Glock steady in his hands, eyes fixed on the weathered cabin no more than 20 feet ahead. Inside, the false coffin sat under the dim moonlight slicing through a cracked roof. It looked identical to the original, heavy, black, unnerving. But this time, it wasn't hiding secrets. It was bait. Lila was to his left, hidden behind a mossy boulder. Her rifle was ready, her stance coiled. Her dark auburn hair was tied back in a tight braid beneath her cap, and her sharp eyes flicked between the cabin and the woods. Born and raised in Pinebrook, Lila had been the department's youngest deputy before earning her stripes as a reliable and quick-thinking officer. Her quiet demeanor often masked a steel resolve that few dared challenge. Further back, Dean Wallace and 2 FBI agents were monitoring a live drone feed from a temporary surveillance post. Shadow lay low beside Mark, his sable coat blending with the earth, ears alert and nose twitching every few seconds. Despite the stillness, Mark could feel Shadow vibrating with anticipation. Not fear, not anxiety, but instinct sharpened by trust and years of experience. The sting was set. Hours earlier, Dean had confirmed a second site, a small, decrepit farmhouse near the state border. Hidden in its cellar, the real coffin had been found, lined not with velvet but with foam compartments, some still holding drug residue and smuggled goods. It confirmed what they feared. The fake coffin was only one piece in a network of mobile trafficking. Yet Shadow had done more. As the team swept the old property, he pawed at a patch of soil beneath a rotting tree stump. Digging revealed plastic-wrapped bundles, cash, burner phones, and a blood-stained shirt. Evidence buried like bones. Now, under the cloak of darkness, it was time for the final piece. Movement. Mark barely shifted his weight as a low rustle crept through the underbrush. A red flare blinked twice on Dean's tracker. Confirmation from the surveillance drone. Figures approaching. 3. No. 4. They moved cautiously. Not like hikers, not like teenagers daring a ghost story. These were professionals, dressed in dark tactical wear, eyes darting, one of them carrying a long canvas bag. Another clutched a crowbar. Shadow growled just low enough for Mark to feel it through the ground. As they reached the cabin door, one man stepped forward and tried the handle. Unlocked. The door creaked open. They slipped inside. Lila tapped her earpiece. "Team A, visual confirmation. Stand by." Dean's voice came through. "Hold until the coffin is touched. We want them red-handed." Then, just as the last man entered, another figure appeared behind them, face partially obscured by a hood. But Mark recognized the walk, the slouched shoulders, the way the man scanned the area too quickly. He stiffened. Sheriff Harold Boyd. Once the revered sheriff of Pinebrook, Boyd had retired early, citing health reasons. But rumors had lingered. Whispers of evidence tampering, odd transfers of inmates, sudden property purchases in the woods. No one had ever proven anything. Until now. Mark's jaw tightened. Lila's eyes met his. She saw it too. "Hold," Dean ordered. "Wait for the lift." Inside, the man with the crowbar wedged the end under the coffin lid and began to pry. Mark could feel the tension coil tighter, breath slowing, heartbeat measured. Then, the lid opened. "Go!" The forest erupted. Flashbangs exploded like summer lightning. Red and blue strobes shattered the dark. Shouts and boots thundered from every side. One suspect tried to run, but Shadow leapt from the underbrush, slamming into his side and dragging him down. The man screamed, but Shadow held firm, pinning him until Lila arrived with cuffs. Inside the cabin, another suspect swung at an agent with a baton. Mark tackled him from behind, slamming him against the wall. The crowbar clattered to the floor. Boyd, in the chaos, tried to slip out the back, but Dean was waiting. "Hands up, Sheriff!" Dean barked, gun trained. Boyd froze. "Dean," he began. "Save it," Dean said, stepping forward. "You built this whole thing, right under your badge." As agents secured the others, Mark walked over to Shadow, still holding the subdued suspect. "Good boy," he whispered, brushing mud from Shadow's ear. It was over in under 5 minutes. Back at the station, the evidence mounted. Inside Boyd's house, they found files, documents detailing smuggling routes, lists of officers paid to look the other way. And under floorboards? The backup hard drive, even more damning than the USB. In the interrogation room, Boyd said little. His once confident face sagged with the weight of exposure. "You think this town gave a damn about justice?" he said bitterly. "I just gave people what they wanted. Peace, order. I took a cut. That's how it works." Mark didn't respond. He didn't need to. The sting in the pines had burned away the lies. And in the end, it wasn't high-tech drones or layers of bureaucracy that cracked the case. It was an old German shepherd, with one bent ear and eyes that missed nothing. Morning in Pinebrook came slowly, the kind of dawn that didn't so much break as it whispered across the treetops. Light filtered through the pines in golden shafts, bathing the town in the softest glow it had seen in years. In that light, truth no longer had a shadow to hide behind. The sting operation had ended just 5 days ago, but its impact had shaken the very roots of the sleepy mountain town. News vans had swarmed the Pinebrook Police Department parking lot like crows, and every front porch bore conversations about corruption, betrayal, and the old dog who wouldn't let evil go unnoticed. Shadow lay stretched across a thick, woven rug in the middle of the precinct lobby. Not a store-bought rug, but hand-stitched by a retired officer's wife, deep forest green with gold trim. In the center, embroidered with care, a silver paw and a badge number. Shadow, 07 to 12. His eyes were closed, but his ears flicked at the sound of familiar boots. Mark stepped inside the station, cradling a fresh cup of coffee. His uniform was crisp, but the fatigue clung beneath his eyes, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of finality. He knelt beside Shadow, scratching gently behind the bent ear. "Morning, hero," he said softly. The precinct had changed. A new sheriff was being appointed, interim leadership under Lila until a town vote. There was a new air of vigilance and pride. Corruption had been rooted out like rot in a fallen tree, and though scars remained, they were the kind that healed stronger. In the break room, Lila flipped through a leather-bound folder, the title engraved in gold leaf. Through the Pines, a deputy's journal. Her shoulders, usually taut with duty, had relaxed. She looked up as Mark entered. "That the start of your memoir?" he asked. "Yours, actually," she replied, sliding the folder toward him. "I just organized your reports. Dean says the Bureau's interested in publishing it through their historical case archive." Mark chuckled, easing into the chair opposite her. "Can't believe people would want to read about a dog who stole my spotlight." Lila's lips curved into a rare smile. "That dog saved all our necks." Outside, Gabe's mother arrived in a worn green SUV. Lisa Donnelly, mid-30s, small frame, eyes too old for her age. Her years had been shaped by hardship, a divorce, 2 jobs, raising Gabe alone. She stepped out with Gabe in tow, the boy's hand tightly in hers. Gabe had been healing quickly. The bruises had faded, but his voice was still cautious, his laughter quiet. But when he saw Shadow through the glass doors, something changed. The boy broke into a sprint. Shadow stirred and stood just as Gabe reached the entrance. The dog's tail wagged gently, and he nuzzled Gabe's chest as the boy dropped to his knees. "I told Mom he was magic," Gabe whispered. Lisa knelt beside them, tears threatening. "Thank you," she said to Mark, her voice trembling. "He wouldn't talk for 2 days, not until he saw that dog's picture in the paper." Mark crouched beside her. "He's safe now. That's all that matters." Later that afternoon, the ceremony was held at the town square. It wasn't grand, but it was heartfelt. Pine Brook's mayor, a balding man named Clark Hennessy, stood on the wooden steps of City Hall with a ribboned box in hand. The American flag fluttered above as he cleared his throat. "We are gathered here to honor those who stood against the shadows that crept into our home," he began. "To Deputy Lila Ross, to Officer Mark Steele, to the FBI team, and to one very good boy." The crowd laughed softly. Shadow was called to the podium. Mark led him up the steps where Mayor Hennessy knelt and opened the box. Inside was a silver-plated medal shaped like a shield, etched with the words, "Valor, Loyalty, Service." The crowd stood and applauded as the mayor gently clipped it to Shadow's collar. The dog blinked, then licked the mayor's cheek. "Guess he approves," Hennessy grinned. Mark stood back, looking out at the crowd, families, children, officers, the town whole again. For the first time in years, he felt peace settle into his chest. Not the kind bought by silence, but earned through truth. That night, Mark loaded Shadow into his pickup and drove north of town, deeper into the woods where cabins dotted the hillside. One of them was his now, a small wooden home left behind by his uncle. Moss-covered porch, fireplace, creaky floorboards, but it was safe, quiet, and surrounded by trees. Shadow hopped down from the truck and limped up the porch steps, as if he'd always belonged there. Inside, Mark unpacked the essentials. A bedroll for himself, a thick padded mat for Shadow beside the hearth. On the mantel, he placed the medal. Later, as fire crackled and wind teased the pine needles, Mark sat on the porch with a cup of cocoa, Shadow at his feet. The stars above Cedar Hollow blinked into view one by one, like ancient eyes watching a town rebuild itself. "You know," Mark murmured, running a hand down Shadow's back, "they offered to station you in the city, train other K9s, fancy kennels, retire in style." Shadow looked up at him, huffed softly, and rested his head back down on Mark's boot. "I thought so," Mark smiled. Behind them, the light from the cabin window spilled onto the porch like a promise. They weren't just survivors of a case. They were family now. 2 old souls, battle-worn, finding peace not in silence, but in the sound of trees swaying and stars telling stories older than time. The pines had held their secrets long enough. Now they carried light. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. They arrive on 4 legs, in the shape of loyalty, courage, and quiet love. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder that God places guardians in our lives when we least expect them, to protect, to guide, and to heal wounds no one else can see. In a world where darkness often hides in plain sight, may we all have the eyes to notice the silent heroes around us, the ones who fight not for recognition, but out of love. Just like Mark and Shadow, we too can choose to stand for truth, to protect the innocent, and to let light break through the pines of our everyday lives. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes in hope. Comment Amen if you believe that God still works miracles through His creations, even through a wounded dog. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of redemption, faith, and the unspoken bond between souls. And may the Lord bless you, your family, and all who walk beside you in love and courage.
A blind old veteran was surrounded by 6 wolves. Then a German shepherd appeared, and what happened next left rangers in tears. The wind howled like a living creature, tearing through the skeletal pines and driving snow sideways across the frozen earth. Jacob Morris, a 73-year-old blind veteran of the United States Army, stood motionless in the middle of the whiteout. The cold bit through his heavy wool coat, creeping into his bones, but he did not flinch. His gloved hand clutched a walking stick, the other gripping an empty leash that swung freely in the wind. His dog was gone. Only an hour ago he had left his cabin near the edge of the Alaska wilderness for their usual morning walk. The snow had only just begun to fall. He knew the paths by heart, counting his steps with practiced precision, but then he had stepped onto a patch of hidden ice near a ravine. His cane slipped. His body followed. He rolled, slid, and crashed through underbrush until he landed hard in a pocket of forest far from the trail. The leash had snapped. The dog was gone, and so was the way back. He had tried to call for help, but his phone, tucked deep inside his coat, had no signal. Now the battery was nearly dead. The snow had grown heavier. Trees groaned under its weight. His boots crunched over frozen branches as he tried to move, but every direction felt wrong. The wind distorted sound. Everything around him sounded alive and unfamiliar. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not 1 or 2, but many. Soft, precise, deliberate. He stopped. His breathing slowed. Then came a low growl. Deep, drawn out, primal. Jacob turned his head. The sound came from his left, another came from his right, and then another behind him. Though he could not see, his body understood what was happening. He was being circled, surrounded. 6 wolves, fully grown, their paws silent on the snow, had emerged from the trees. He could feel their presence like the weight of thunder on the horizon. Their growls intensified, blending with the wind in a dreadful harmony. Jacob tightened his grip on the cane. His mind raced, his heart pounded, but his body stood still. He knew wild animals. He had heard them before. He had fought worse in wars long past, but never like this. Never blind, alone, and helpless. He braced himself for the end. Then came a sound he knew. A bark, sharp, powerful, commanding. It sliced through the wind like a bullet. Another bark followed, then the crunch of paws moving fast through snow. A figure burst through the trees. Jacob could not see it, but the sound of the footfalls, the pattern of the breathing, the rhythm of the bark, it struck him like a memory. It was her, the German shepherd. She raced forward and placed herself between Jacob and the wolves, her body stiff, her head low, ears forward. She did not cower. She growled, deep and loud, speaking a language not of panic, but of authority. And then, silence. The wolves stopped. No more growling. No advance. They did not run. They did not attack. They simply stood, facing her, and waited. Jacob, trembling, whispered through cracked lips, What in God's name is going on? The answer stood before him, breathing heavy, her fur thick with snow, her eyes fixed on the wolf. They did not move because they knew her. Years before Jacob ever found himself in that deadly circle of wolves, another storm had raged across the same mountains. It was a storm not unlike the one that now buried the forest in silence, but colder, crueler. One of those once-in-a-decade blizzards that made even the strongest animals vanish into the earth for shelter. High in the northern ridges near the edge of the protected wilderness, a lone female wolf staggered through the snow, blood trailing from a wound on her flank. She had given birth only days before. Her den, just a shallow crevice beneath a fallen log, barely shielded the pups from the wind. But she was too weak, too broken. Her instincts told her to return. Her body told her she could not. In the end, she limped away into the storm and was never seen again. Inside the den, 6 newborn wolf pups huddled together, blind and helpless, their cries thin and fading. Their tiny bodies could not retain heat. Their mother's scent grew fainter with every hour. Death had already begun to gather at the edges of the cave. But that night, another creature wandered the woods, a German shepherd female, emaciated, half-wild, with cracked paws and a torn ear, dragged herself through the snow in search of food or shelter. She had been abandoned by hunters weeks before, and her last litter had perished in the cold. Her teeth still held milk, her body driven by grief and instinct, searching for something she could no longer name. She heard the crying, faint, distant, fragile. She followed the sound until she reached the log. Inside she saw them, 6 trembling shapes, covered in frost, barely alive. She could have left. Instead, she crawled into the den. She curled her body around them, wrapping them in her heat. She licked their tiny faces, nudged them toward her belly. They latched on. The milk flowed. The crying stopped, and in that moment, something impossible happened. Over the days that followed, the shepherd became their mother. She hunted what little she could: snowshoe hares, field mice, sometimes even scraps stolen from predator kills. She brought the food back piece by piece, tore it into soft portions, and dropped it gently at their feet. She taught them how to move in the snow, how to scent danger, how to wait for silence before striking. She did not just keep them alive, she raised them. And when spring came and the thaw returned, they grew strong enough to hunt alone. One by one they ventured beyond the ridge, disappearing into the woods like the wolves they were born to be. But none of them ever forgot. Every winter, when the snow came thick and heavy, they returned to the place where the den had once been, sometimes alone, sometimes together. They found her, they circled her with affection, they nuzzled her sides, they lay with her beneath the stars. She had not birthed them, she had not looked like them, but to them she was mother, and to her they were her children, raised not by blood, but by a bond stronger than instinct. Of bond built in snow, in silence, in survival. The silence in the clearing was thick enough to feel almost holy. The German shepherd stood tall between Jacob and the wolves, her breath misting in the frozen air. The growl in her throat deepened, a guttural vibration that came not from fear, but from something more commanding. A tone that echoed years of authority, of memory, of instinct. One by one, the 6 wolves began to step back. Their bodies remained tense, but their eyes softened. They lowered their heads slightly, not in submission to the man, but in recognition of her. Jacob tilted his head. Though blind, he felt the shift in the air, the growls fading, the pressure easing, and then the bark. Not just any bark, but a sound carved into the deepest vaults of his memory. His voice cracked. "Maggie?" The name fell from his lips like a prayer. "Maggie, is that you?" His fingers trembled as he reached forward. The dog turned and slowly approached, her steps careful, deliberate. When her nose touched his hand, the years melted away. She licked his palm once, then pressed her head into his chest. Jacob dropped to his knees. "Oh God," he whispered, his arms wrapping around her neck. "You came back after all these years." Years ago he had found her, thin, limping, half-frozen, trapped in a crevice of ice near the tree line. He had pulled her free, fed her, sheltered her in his cabin. He had called her Maggie, named after his late wife. For a while, she had been everything, his eyes, his companion, his reason to go on. And then, during a fierce winter storm, she vanished. He had searched until the snow erased her tracks. Grief and guilt had followed ever since. But now, here she was, alive, strong, different, but still Maggie. She let out a short series of low, rhythmic growls and yips. The wolves responded immediately. They circled Jacob, moving in slow, calculated arcs, but kept their distance. Then, to his astonishment, they stopped and lowered their heads, not in fear, but in something that felt eerily like respect. Jacob's hand tightened on Maggie's fur. "You raised them, didn't you? You're their mother." She did not answer, but she did not need to. Nightfall came quickly in the mountains. The wind picked up, sharper now. Jacob lay on the cold ground, exhaustion and cold overtaking him, but Maggie curled tightly beside him, her body blocking the wind. One of the wolves moved closer, then another. Before long, the pack had formed a loose wall around them, their bodies a living fortress of warmth. Jacob drifted into a fitful sleep, but he did not feel alone. Then came the noise. Far off at first, faint whines, mechanical and sharp, then growing louder. Snowmobiles, followed by the unmistakable clicks of safety catches released from rifles. Jacob's eyes flew open. Maggie raised her head, ears erect, body tense. 3 men on snowmobiles burst through the tree line, headlights casting pale cones across the snow. They wore heavy camo jackets, goggles, and thick boots. Their rifles hung across their backs. One of them shouted, "There they are, right where the tracker said." Another pointed at Jacob. "Who the hell is that? You with wildlife protection, old man?" Jacob struggled to stand. "I am not with anyone. I am lost." "Too bad," one muttered, raising his rifle. "You just saw too much." Then everything happened at once. Maggie lunged forward, snarling, her bark fierce enough to shake snow from the branches above. The wolves exploded into motion, emerging from the shadows like phantoms. Fast, coordinated, terrifying. One man fired into the air, hoping to scatter them. They did not flinch. Instead, they moved with eerie precision, forming a wide arc around Jacob. Their eyes glowed amber in the headlights. Their bodies blocked every path to him. Maggie remained in front, unyielding. The leader raised his weapon again, but a massive gray wolf leapt, jaws clamping onto the barrel and ripping it away. The gun clattered to the ground and was buried in snow. Panic set in. The men turned and fled, slipping, stumbling back onto their machines, engines roaring as they disappeared into the trees, shouting curses and disbelief behind them. Then, silence again. Jacob exhaled, for the first time in minutes. The wolves returned to their places. One stood near his shoulder, another lay at his feet. Maggie patted back to him, pressing her side into his once more. He placed a trembling hand on her head. "They are not beasts," he whispered. "They are her sons." The first pale rays of dawn stretched across the frozen treetops, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Jacob stirred from sleep, aching, stiff, but alive. His limbs were numb, but his heart beat steady beneath his coat. Around him the forest was still. The wolves stood silently at a respectful distance. Maggie was beside him, warm and alert, her ears twitching at the faintest sounds. She nudged him gently, then turned toward the trees and began to walk. Jacob understood. With great effort he stood and followed, leaning on Maggie's shoulder. One of the wolves moved to his other side, then another. They formed a quiet procession, leading him not along any visible path, but through dense forest, through snow so deep and untouched that only the wild dared travel there. Soon, Maggie stopped near a tangle of fallen branches and roots, an old thicket that looked solid to the eye. She nosed aside a curtain of hanging moss, revealing a narrow passage beneath the roots, a natural tunnel, carved over years by melting snow and animal instinct. Without hesitation she entered. So did the wolves. Jacob ducked low and stepped inside, the cool earth brushing against his gloves. The tunnel was not long, but it curved gently, protected from the wind. As he walked, he could feel the faint warmth of the animals around him, the shared breath of creatures who had once lived here in hiding. Wolves born in silence, raised beneath the very roots he now touched. On the other side, light broke through the trees. The air was fresher. He emerged into a small hollow, a meadow long abandoned by humans. There, one of the wolves darted into the underbrush. Moments later, it returned carrying something in its jaws, a snowshoe hare, freshly killed. It approached Jacob and, slowly, carefully laid the animal at his feet. He froze. No one spoke, no sound but the wind. They were not offering food. They were offering thanks, a gift, a lesson learned from their mother, who had once given them everything when they had nothing. Now they gave back to the one human who had once saved her. Jacob's throat tightened, his sightless eyes filled with tears. He said nothing. He did not need to. By midday the group reached a long-forgotten weather outpost nestled on a ridge, barely visible behind layers of frost and pine. Maggie approached the metal door and scratched gently. Moments later, it creaked open, and a technician stepped out, blinking in disbelief. Standing before him was an elderly blind man, covered in snow, supported by a German shepherd, and surrounded by 6 wolves, calm and silent as sentinels. The technician stumbled backward. "Sir, are you all right? What is this?" Jacob smiled faintly. "It brought me home." The technician activated the emergency transmitter. Within hours, park rangers, journalists, and wildlife officials arrived, each more stunned than the last. Security cameras captured the moment Jacob was led from the forest. News stations picked up the footage. The images of wolves and dogs standing shoulder to shoulder beside a man went viral across the world. The headlines followed: "Wolves protect blind veteran in Arctic storm." "The dog who raised a pack and returned to repay a debt." Debates ensued. One conservation official insisted the wolves be sedated and relocated, citing safety concerns and the need to restore natural behavior. But opposition came fast and fierce, from scientists, from veterans, from schoolchildren. One letter read, "You do not separate a family just because it does not look like one you recognize." The story spread to every corner of the internet. A petition launched overnight gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. The argument was no longer about science. It was about something older, about love and loyalty and bonds that defied biology. Eventually, the final decision was made. Maggie and her wolves would remain together. They were given sanctuary in a newly designated protected zone called the White Forest Sanctuary, a vast stretch of land where no hunters, no fences, and no separation would intrude. Rangers would monitor from a distance, but otherwise, the pack would live as they always had, together, under open sky, where no one could tell them they did not belong. And the world watched, awed, as a new chapter began. Not in a lab, not in a zoo, but in the wild, where a mother once lost everything and found it again, in the most unexpected way. Months had passed since Jacob Morris returned from the forest. The storm had ended, but its memory lived on in every quiet breath of wind, every shadow that stretched across the snow. He had left behind the small town, the noise, the curiosity of cameras and questions, and settled into a modest wooden cabin near the edge of the White Forest Sanctuary. From his front porch he could not see the trees, but he could feel them. He could feel her, Though blind, Jacob found a new purpose. He sat for hours each day, his hands moving across the keys of an old Braille typewriter, pressing into the silence with every letter. He poured the story out, word by word, memory by memory. The story of a forgotten dog, a pack of orphaned wolves, and a promise kept through blizzard and time. He titled the manuscript, "The Ones Who Walk with Her." When it was published, it took flight like wildfire. The book spread across the country, across continents, translated, taught, quoted in classrooms. American school children read it aloud during units on empathy and kinship. Veterans whispered about it during quiet gatherings. Scientists debated it in forums. But the message needed no translation. Love was not a matter of species, nor was loyalty. On a soft winter afternoon, snow drifting like feathers across the land, Jacob sat outside his cabin in a thick coat, a wool blanket draped across his knees. He did not speak. He only listened. And then he heard it. Snow crunching beneath large, deliberate paws. Breath deep and steady. She came first. Maggie, slower now, gray in her muzzle, but still carrying the grace of command, walked toward him with a proud, purposeful gait. Behind her came 6 wolves, fully grown, their bodies strong and magnificent, but their movements gentle, as if the wild itself had softened for this moment. They stopped in a semicircle around the porch. One of the wolves stepped forward and lowered its head, brushing against Jacob's hand. He reached out slowly, fingers finding fur. Warm, familiar. Maggie came last, placing her head softly on his knee. Jacob smiled through tears. "She was not their kind," he whispered, his voice cracking like old ice. "But she was always their mother, and I was just the man lucky enough to love them both." In a world where survival often depends on strength and instinct, this story reminds us that the greatest force of all may be something far more powerful: love without boundaries, loyalty without reason, and the quiet return of a debt paid not in words but in life itself. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that compassion can cross even the wildest divides, then you are already part of what we believe in. For more heartwarming, true stories like this, stories of animals, of miracles, of unbreakable bonds, subscribe now to Amazing Paws Stories, because some stories do not just touch the heart, they change it.